Thank you, Mr. Streeter. Can I start by congratulating my honourable friend for securing this timely debate, but also for the wider efforts he's undertaken to coordinate members in this House, those who are concerned that the government step up and do more. 264 days have now passed since we watched flames engulf the Grenfell Tower block in North Kensington, and yet on private freehold developments across the country, hundreds of thousands of residents are still living with the knowledge that their homes are covered in lethal material. New Capital Quay, a vast 980-home development in my constituency, is only one of hundreds of such cases, but it's perhaps the most high-profile. Cladding on the site failed tests carried out by the department in July of last year, and 8 months on, that cladding and the insulation remain in place with no timescale for its removal and replacement, and with an inadequate and very expensive Waking Watch fire safety patrol still in place. Residents are left in limbo, while the freeholder, Galliard Homes, and the NHBC tussle over whether or not there was a breach of the building regulations at the time of construction and who is liable. A tussle that may be settled out of court but may ultimately be resolved through lengthy litigation. The residents who are stuck in the middle of this messy squabble are terrified at the thought that their families are not safe, leaseholders anxious that they will be hit with the full costs, and in fact one elderly resident said to me at a public meeting last week that she is resigned to the fact that she knows she will not make it out of the building if there's a fire, even with the Waking Watch in place. And what has the government's position been throughout? It's amounted to little more than a muffled and infrequent plea to the private companies involved not to attempt to pass on the costs to leaseholders. No attempt has been made by the government to ensure that dangerous cladding is removed as a matter of urgency. And that's no surprise in many ways, because when it comes to the issue of fire safety, government itself is deeply compromised. It was the government in 2013 that failed to act on the recommendations made after the 2009 Larkenau House disaster, and that chose not to rewrite the procedural guidance set out in approved document B. It was the government that did nothing to prevent the installation of combustible polyethylene ACM cladding of the type found on New Capital Quay. It was the government, presumably on the basis of the advice from the BRE, that in 2006 opened the door to combustible insulation material, such as the K15 Kingspan insulation found on New Capital Quay, being approved as compliant through testing when previously it had been impossible to get guidance by that route. And while it was the Building Control Alliance that determined to introduce a new route to compliance through desktop studies, and whose members, as the market became increasingly competitive, began to approve cladding without even the need for a desktop study, I find it hard to believe that the government were not aware that that was taking place, and yet they failed to amend approved document B to respond to it. If one steps back from all the legal wrangling that is taking place between private companies in relation to cladding and insulation on private freehold developments, it is the flawed nature of the building regulations regime, the inadequacy of the procedural guidance within that regime, and the passive response of government to the behaviour of the combustible industry since 2014 that explains why dangerous combustible cladding and insulation of the kind that surrounds the homes of my constituents was signed off as compliant. I want to be clear, the fault does not lie only with Conservative governments since 2010. Successive governments have failed to ensure the building regulations regime is fit for purpose. But government does have a duty to act. If not a legal, then certainly a moral one. And can I just say to the Minister, they can act very quickly and very speedily in a way that will make a big difference to my constituents by issuing clear, prescriptive advice as to the final date by which dangerous combustible cladding must be removed from developments like New Capital Quay. That's the least that my constituents deserve and others in a similar situation across the country.